Hello, everyone. Greetings from Oxford. Many thanks for joining us in this virtual roundtable. My name is Danica Salazar, and I am Executive Editor for World Englishes for Oxford Languages, Oxford University Press. I work with a team of lexicographers on researching and writing entries for the Oxford English Dictionary with the aim of expanding our knowledge of how the English lexicon has evolved through time. We're always looking at the dictionary from that angle, so it's always a pleasure for me to look at it from the other side, from the point of view of the dictionary's users, who use the dictionary to carry out all kinds of fascinating research to answer various theoretical questions, as well as address different real-life issues. So today we're exploring one of these issues, the teaching and assessing of phonics, and how we can recognize diversity in pronunciation in the English classroom. It's truly a privilege for me to be joined today by this esteemed panel of speakers. So with us is my colleague, Dr. Catherine Sangster, who is Executive Editor for Pronunciations at Oxford Languages, or Oxford University Press. And with me today in Oxford is Dr. Hye-Jung An, who is Senior Lecturer at the Faculty of Education of the University of Melbourne. And joining us from China is Ms. Joy Onyemaechi, who is a language assessment consultant for the British Council in Beijing, China. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So let us get started with a discussion first by so that our audience can also get to know you and your research a little bit better. So could you talk briefly about your linguistic background and how it has led you to your current research in English? Perhaps you could start with Catherine.
So my academic background is in sociolinguistics, especially sociophonetics. So my research originally was around Liverpool English and accents of English within the British Isles. And then I worked as a pronunciation advisor to the BBC for about 10 years, and now I work in lexicography. So my job involves working out how new words that are added to the dictionary ought to be pronounced, and keeping an eye on whether pronunciations change over time. And as we'll come on to, particularly we've expanded our work in the area of looking at varieties of English other than the standard varieties in Britain and the US. So that's been something that's expanded recently and is very pertinent to this panel.
Thanks, Catherine. Hye-Jung.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hye-Jung. I'm Korean English language speaker. So my research interest normally includes in primary literacy in L1 English speaking context, as well as English as an additional language, or some people say TESOL, teaching English as speaker other than English speakers. And I've worked particularly from World English's perspective. So I worked in a number of countries, including Singapore, Korea, and Australia. When I worked in this country, they have different versions of standard English. In Korea, they use American English as standard. In Singapore, they use, RP, received pronunciation as standard. In Australia, we use Australian English as standard English. This kind of different versions of standard English actually prompt my current research on phonics teaching, where all different English is used, but yet phonics teaching based on one single set of standard pronunciation. This ways my research try to look for ways to improve phonics teaching, more inclusive ways, try to avoid marginalization of other Englishes. Thank you.
Thank you, Hye-Jung. Joy.
Yes, welcome everyone. My name is Joy. Presently with the English and Exams Unit at the British Council, which is something I've done since 2016 in different places from Nigeria and the UK, and now in Beijing. My research interest is primarily in the teaching and assessment of oral English, especially in the Nigerian context. In 2017, I was a Hornby scholar. I'm sure you're aware of the AS Hornby Scholarship Trust UK. And the main purpose or the vision of the Hornby Trust is to kind of help research work in English language teaching, especially in developing countries. So as a Hornby scholar in the UK, my research interest was in the area of the assessment of oral English. And that is because of the unique situation in English, in Nigeria and the West African sub-region as a whole. It's kind of amazing that in 2024, we still do paper-based tests of orals. and that is because, we can't get it right. So that has been my area of interest. And all the time I was at Warwick University, I did a number of works with English language teachers in Nigeria, and were able to come up with a kind of a solution. And this is something that even the Ministry of Education is looking at. Schools are beginning to, embrace communicative competence, instead of linguistic competence, which is what has been in the name of Queen's English, standard pronunciation and all of that. I think we're beginning to realize that, hey, communication is actually the whole essence of language, and that's what we should be mindful of when it comes to English language, especially in the speaking aspect. So that's basically my area of interest and research engagements.
Thank you. So it's very clear that all three of you are experts on, in the field of pronunciation. So so pronunciation, accents is really what is probably the most obvious to people when it comes to differences in varieties of English. So could I just get your thoughts on accents, and why do you think people are predisposed to be judgmental towards those who speak differently from them? What do you think, Catherine, about that?
I think it's a really, really big question, and it's difficult to address it in as briefly as is required here. But there's all kinds of reasons, right? And if we're looking at, in a global context, if we're looking at the use of English, Hye-jung's already mentioned received pronunciation. Joy's mentioned the idea of the Queen's English and standard forms, and the presence of those supposed standards can be what drives accent prejudice. I think can be what well, if you're not doing it like this, then you're not doing it right. And I think the enterprise of trying to broaden what we acknowledge as a dictionary, what we acknowledge and recognize as English in all its forms, it's a way to address that, and it's a way to try and bring some equity and some justice to a very uneven playing field, to deliver a situation that is really very unjust. So that's my thoughts.
I agree entirely, Catherine. But OED is a bit responsible for this consistent, promotion of standard English, I think. But I think, it's a deep, societal bias that associate particular accent with prestige and others, inferior. And then, and I do blame, I think education departments and, prestigious publishers are playing big roles in consistently promoting particular accent as correct ones and others and not so much. And then this, promotion, have led to discrimination, reinforcing stereotypes and inequality, I think. Joy?
Yes, the truth is that everyone has an accent.
Yeah.
That is the thing. It's as unique as fingerprints. So if you say one accent is correct, then that means there are 5 billion correct accents, because no two individuals speak alike. That is the truth. So whether you are in Oxford or Cambridge or Bangladesh or China, there are variations. So the whole idea is to embrace the uniqueness. And then I've been working with Chinese students Chinese speakers of English language. There is a version that is evolving. We may begin to embrace it as a Chinese English, as it were, because the more, you have to give people the liberty to express themselves in English but then they are originally Chinese. And you can't take the Chinese away from the Chinese speaker of English. You cannot take the Nigerianness away from the Nigerian speaker of English. However, we should be able to communicate. We should be able to convey messages in a way that is comprehensible. So moving away, accepting and realizing the uniqueness and the diversities while not watering down the basics, the fundamentals, and the standards of communication. I think that is the goal that everyone is beginning to wake up to, and I think that's interesting. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting that nowadays, people are so much more aware of not being discriminatory with other people, but it feels like sometimes accents is something accent discrimination is still something that's somehow socially sanctioned. Like even today, you can still see newspaper articles where there are surveys ranking accents by their attractiveness. Ranking British accents by which ones are the most attractive. You could never do that. Ranking different cities in the UK based on their attractiveness as people, but somehow when you frame that as attractiveness of accents, it's still all right. So we're still slowly waking up to not being aware of that we shouldn't do that, but it's quite slow. And I think you're right, Yejong, in taking us to task a little bit there, because yes, it's true that the OED and other dictionaries have contributed to this like monolithic view of pronunciation, because for the longest time they've only offered either standard British English, received pronunciation, or American English, standard American English as, in their pronunciation information that they provide, they've only provided pronunciations for those standard varieties. But this is something that we've been, at least in the Oxford English Dictionary, we have been trying to address in the past few years. And Catherine, of course, as head of pronunciations for Oxford Languages, has been at the forefront of that work in the OED. So Catherine, could you tell us a bit more about the work that's currently being done in the OED to create pronunciation models, not just for standard British and American English, but also for different varieties of English?
Yes, absolutely. And I think this is what this has been one of the most powerful kind of tools in trying to counteract that use of the dictionary in educational contexts and assessment contexts as an oppressive tool, which is not, I think, what its makers intend, but certainly seems to be how it can be deployed if we're not careful. I also made a little poll, which I believe is about to open, which is just to ask people, do you actually know that the OED has World English pronunciations covered, other than the British and US standards? So yes, the OED since 2016, it had coverage of varieties of English other than British and US earlier than that, but since 2016 we started adding audio. So what we have on words which are designated as belonging to any of the 16 varieties of English other than British and US that we cover, we offer a pronunciation transcription and a piece of audio which is spoken by an authentic actual speaker of that variety of English. We record our audio ourselves in-house. We have a little recording studio that we use. So it's real live people, not synthetically generated. And so we've been researching those models and providing those, say, for 8 years now, and we continually make sure that they're correct. The models that we set, so what we try and do is create a transcription model for a variety, for something like Canadian English or West African English, Singapore and Malaysian English, and so forth. And we don't do all the, we don't start from nowhere. We look at existing studies, existing research, and try and work out a model that is suitable for a dictionary that will reflect the major features of that particular variety of English. And then we render all of the words that are in the dictionary that are labelled as belonging to that variety in that variety too. And those models exist for people to use. They're on the website. So for each of the 16 varieties, it explains what the model is. So how are we transcribing the vowels? How are we transcribing the consonants? Where do we get this from? So links to the scholarship that the models are based on. And those are available for, they are there to support and justify the transcriptions that we give in the dictionary, but they're also available for wider use and for research purposes, which is what has begun to happen.
Right. Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, so I'd like to turn now to Joy and Hyejong, and so we could look a little bit more at the specific context of, that you are both in. So could you describe how English is used in your case, in Australia, in your case, Hyejong, and in Nigeria, Joy? So what are the prevailing perceptions of English pronunciations in those countries, and how do these perceptions affect the way that English pronunciation or phonics is taught and tested? So and then how has that in turn impacted students' learning outcomes? Hyejong, can you start?
Okay, in Australia, mainly there are largely, broadly speaking, there are two kinds of varieties of English being recognized in a way. So Australian Standard Australian English and Aboriginal English. Although when it comes to standard, the learning education model, we're talking about Standard Australian English. Although in Victoria Department Educational website, I'm talking of Victoria, in Australia there are 8 jurisdictions. Each state and territory have its own education department. So I'm not talking about entire Australia. I'm talking about Victorian context. So in Victorian Education Department website, it introduced some phonological features of Aboriginal English to be used for teacher resources. But publicly speaking, largely, when it comes to education, the goal and standard is Standard Australian English, and Aboriginal English is still maybe seen as broken or bad English. So when it comes to phonics teaching, the idea of other English is very, very received any attention at the moment. So I'm really hard to say about learning outcomes teaching phonics from speakers of other English language speakers. There's actually no studies. Although when it comes to phonics in L1 context, phonics in L2 context, phonics in L1 context is slightly different learning outcomes, I think. L2 context perhaps is talking about speaking aspect, while in L1 context is more for reading outcomes. So we teach phonics to help students to reading achievement. But interestingly, the way we assess phonics is based on students' production skills. So we're asking students to tick, pronounce a sound. If they produce in a correct way of saying, teachers tend to tick, it's in a correct way. So unfortunately, there are some studies talking about teaching explicit phonics to students who have reading difficulties or dyslexic. There are some studies and positive outcomes on teaching phonics. But actually, there's very little studies in L1 context for students whose English is not Standard Australian English. So I'm not here to say, but that's something that I'm working on to find out any learning outcomes of phonics based on single monolithic way of teaching phonics.
So basically what you're describing here is like if you have a child, say, reading the word cat, right, but pronouncing the vowel in a different way than how you would pronounce it in Australian English, that it would be assumed that they don't know how to read that word and they do not understand the word.
Exactly.
So it's kind of equating the pronouncing the word correctly with being able to read it and understand it. Which I guess we're saying is actually two different
different
skills. Right? Oh, very interesting.
Yeah.
So Joy, what is it like in Nigeria?
In Nigeria, the thing is there appear to be parallel realities in the assessment. Now, because Britain was our colonial masters. So the foundation of Nigerian education was laid by the British. So, and English is the official language. So in schools, the so-called British English is accepted as the standard. However, we also know there is American English. So usually it is the British English and the American English. Now what happens is in the examinations, for example, both of them are accepted. However, consistency is required. For example, in spelling, if you were going to use American spelling, so if you're doing COLOR, for example, then we don't expect that you do LABOUR elsewhere. So if you're going to be consistent with American spelling, it's okay. But then if it is English spelling, that's okay as well. But you see, that is so complicated and so confusing because even the teachers themselves do not even seem to know the difference between the two. Now, when it comes to pronunciation, what we do is we tend to take the so-called received pronunciation. We call it the received pronunciation, Queen's English, which I always say is not used anywhere in the world. Queen's English exists, on paper only, not anywhere on the planet. So yeah. So when we assess phonetics, which is what we call it. Now, what we do is we're expecting students to identify isolated sounds. So, for example, we have the word spelled as CAT, and then you're going to ask the student, what is the vowel sound contained in that CAT? And then, so it is the sound as transcribed. So what we're interested in is the student able to identify the phonetic transcription of letter A. However, in real usage, everybody says cat. Nobody actually says cat. Yes. But then if in exam, they are not able to identify cat as cat, then we say they have failed the test. And it is so complicated because what we assess on paper is not even what we speak, even as teachers in the classroom. It is not what the education inspectors speak. It is not what the government officials speak. But we want the students to know it. And that is the complication. That's how complicated it is. So the idea is, can we move away from this strict adherence to isolated phonetic, permutations? Because it is frustrating for students. The teachers find it very, very difficult. In fact, some teachers can't even articulate those sounds correctly. They can write it down and the students can copy them and cram them and stick them in the exams, but no one is actually using it. So that's how complicated, it is. And students don't find it interesting and funny at all. It's like we wish, it could be something, a little different. Well, yes. So that's just the whole emphasis, identifying abstract phonetic symbols. That's what we call phonetics. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting. So it looks like in both Australia and Nigeria, it seems like we expect a lot of our both students and teachers, almost separating, at least in testing, there seems to be the separation between what's actually done in the real world and
yes
in examinations, which is not really what you would think would be the objective of teaching.
Yes, I mean,
classroom.
If you transcribed everything I have said now, if you transcribed it, I probably would score 2 out of 100. If we are following those IPA and all of those transcriptions things. That's the thing. So how do we expect the students to actually be able to do it when we don't even know it and can't do it either.
Yeah, that's really a lot to put on honor students. So would you say then that so there are a lot of things that needs to be improved in the teaching and assessment of phonics, of pronunciation. So and it looks like there needs to be we need to be looking at different varieties of English in teaching and assessment. So what aspects should be considered when we're comparing these varieties of English for the purpose of teaching and testing? So because that's what teachers, when we try to suggest improvements to teachers, or we ask teachers to recognize variation in the classroom, the first question, understandably, is always, how do I do that? How do I go about that? Because I've been trained in a different way. I've always been trained to teach in just one monolithic English. So what what do you think should these teachers consider that they should include in their teaching? What should be corrected? What should be taught? So what practical advice could you give teachers in this regard? Joe?
So as I mentioned earlier, phonics teaching in L1 context, English is their first language, have received almost no attention from World English's perspective. While in my understanding, in L2 context, when teaching English as second language, World English does have some presence. And that there is some recognition, very limited, but there are some recognition of different Englishes across different countries, such as American English, British English, or Australian English, and so on. So I'm going to talk about phonics in L1 context in particular for today's talk. So in Australian context, for example, phonics is for reading comprehension. Phonics is for helping students read, and then these phonics are based on standard Australian English. And then the interesting aspect is the way we teach phonics, though, it's about the reading, but the way we teach phonics is asking students to produce the sound. And then the way we assess students is asking students based on their production skills. So, for example, students from America studying in Australia, if they pronounce the word car with R sound, in Australian English, we drop the R sound at the end. But because the teachers understand, we're aware of American English, they won't be marked wrong to students who pronounce R. But we have lots of Indian students whose English is their first language, studying living in Australia. There, for example, according to World English is the information, they tend to pronounce S-I-N-G a G sound at the end. So if the student pronounce with a sing at the end, they're probably gonna mark as wrong. This student didn't master phonological awareness of that. Then we can say, well, R is okay, why not G? Who make that decision? Do you know what I mean? And then why? And also in Singapore English, face with A and E, it's not split digraph. They pronounce it as one vowel. While in Australian English, they split, they say face. And there's those kind of, decisions that's just not even considered in L1 context at the moment. So before I can talk about what should be included, I think the first thing is providing some information to teachers. Hey, there are other than Australian English, and we have in Victoria, about 40% of students speak other than English at home. They are considered L1, EAL, however they are categorized. But they are the really big number of students who speak, not only that, we have American English speakers, British English speakers with a different accent. I think first of all, we need to raise awareness of teachers. Hey, there are more than standard Australian English around the world. Yes. That's it.
And Joy?
Yes, I think those variations should really be taken into account. And a good way to do it is exposure. Teachers need a lot of exposure. Now, if, for example, as a Nigerian teacher, that's surprisingly in different regions of Nigeria, there are also mother tongue uniqueness and interference. So people in the northern part of Nigeria have a way they speak, and when they speak English, you could tell that this person is from the Hausa speaking part of Nigeria. When someone from the Igbo-speaking part of Nigeria talks, you know. When someone from the Yoruba-speaking part of Nigeria talks, you know. And this is just within Nigeria. And like Anne is saying, when you now bring this together, when you now look at the fact that the same thing plays out in different countries and across, in different parts of the world. So I think exposure is very important. For example, sometimes a Chinese student can say snake when they actually mean snack. You know, you will think they said snake, but they're saying snack. Now, in as much as we recognize that there is a variation, that one is something that impedes meaning and it impedes communication. So I think what we should be looking at is, does this variation impede meaning? Does it affect the communication? Because if you say snake when you meant to say snack, you are saying two different things. Snake is a reptile, snack is something you eat. So we don't accept snake when you mean snack. You understand what I'm saying? However, if someone else calls it snack instead of snack, then that is another level of variation which could be accommodated. So I think the emphasis should be, one, is the variation impeding communication? Is it changing the meaning? Is it conveying wrong information? Yes or no? If it is conveying the correct information, nevertheless, then we should be more lenient, you know, in accepting and embracing those variations. And I think this labeling, you know, has to be looked into. I mean, American English, but there is not even one single version of American English, because even in America, people in different parts of America have different accents. We say, okay, it is Australian English. Well, you bring 20 people from Australia and they're all talking differently. So which of the Australian English are we going to take? So I think those labelings and those hierarchies, you know, should be de-emphasized. You know, let us look at communication and, you know, give less emphasis to the labels. Oh, this is American English, that is British English, this is Chinese English, or this is Nigerian English. I think we need to be careful with those labeling to start with.
Yeah, and it's really interesting also how, particularly with, just like we do with grammar, you know, with pronunciation, it seems like in teaching, there's this level of abstraction that really, you know, moves the teaching away from communication into just looking at the language as an object to be learned. And I think that also impacts, I mean, having gone through it myself, you know, I grew up and was educated in the Philippines, which has a similar post-colonial context with English as Nigeria. And what I observed as a student was there was a lot of time spent in the classroom just teaching you pronunciation from a very abstract way that has absolutely nothing to do with the way that we were actually engaging, because English was a part of our lives, but you wouldn't think that it was from the way that it was being taught in the classroom. I'm pretty sure that in Australia and Nigeria, it's like that as well. You know, everybody is exposed to English, but that exposure is not really translated into the classroom in order to improve students' engagement with the language, which is very essential in learning, I think. And now I would like to go back to Hyejong, because you've been working on a very interesting project with. So you mentioned the Department of Education for the state government of Victoria. So they recently published some guidelines for teachers, which actually, you know, includes particular mention of variation in English pronunciation and it's important to recognize different English pronunciations in phonics instruction. and you've actually used the OED in this
Absolutely.
work. So could you tell us more about that?
Yes. I made a little dent in the Victorian State Department, where there is absolutely no awareness about the Englishes other than Aboriginal English. It was there is some Victorian Department, in my view, is very progressive in terms of its educational standard. Used to be. I'm not so sure now, but there is only anything to do with English education is standard Australian English. But last year, I worked with the department on phonics enhancement project, and then part of that project, with help from Catherine, and then OED's World English section, I get to write professional reading material for primary school English teachers. And so the information in OED was fantastic for me to use as a linguist myself, as a scholar. However, so I made that, I used there some of the examples, some scenarios to teacher-friendly language version. So it gone through many, many versions. I had to test it by teacher. Do you understand what I'm talking about? So I had to make it very teacher-friendly, and teacher-friendly who do not necessarily have a linguistic background to be able to use and implement in Australia to avoid marginalization of other English varieties. So my really hope is, and then I also used OED material, World English material, to provide some teaching activities for ESL context in particular. And I think World English is very good in a way to produce the ESL context. But in Australia, the understanding of other English for L1 English, Australian English speakers, understanding of other English is just so limited. And even my little reading, 7 pages long, it was quite comprehensive. But it's a little bit hard for teachers in UK and Australia now. So-called synthetic phonics have been going to be mandated in UK. It's been mandated for the past 10 years, in my view. It is very easy to use for teachers. Not unfortunately, but these synthetic phonics are based on RP, generally speaking, standard Australian English or standard British English. But if we could, OED or Catherine or OED people can produce something equivalent to synthetic phonics scope, and what it does, synthetic phonics, they provide the scope of a particular pronunciation for teachers to use. Although I don't think this is going to be used in classroom because synthetic phonics is mandated in UK. You cannot have a variation according to policy. However, if we could provide something like synthetic phonics scope and sequence for Indian English or some other Englishes that are teacher-friendly, maybe excellent resources to raise awareness. Hey, if students pronounce word in this way, it's not because they don't know phonological awareness, it's their production, and we don't want to correct their English because they don't fit into RP sound. It's essentially phonics for L1 is reading. It's not about pronunciation. So I think this will be really, really, really important to great resources, for teacher education, in my view. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Hye-Jung. And of course, at the Q&A later, you can ask Hye-Jung if you have any particular questions about the project. And now, Joy, going back to Nigeria. So, what concrete steps do you think should be taken by educators and language policymakers? And as you know, in many countries, language policymakers aren't necessarily linguists or language experts. They're usually politicians. But what concrete steps could they take if they were interested in taking such steps? Particularly in Nigeria, to recognize pluricentricity, having more than one center of English in the assessment of oral language.
Yes. There has been a lot of stakeholder engagements in Nigeria. First of all, the Ministry of Education, has actually come to, realize some of the things we're saying. And they think that, if something was handed to us in 1960s, it's about time it is reviewed. And, you can't teach Gen Z generation the way we were taught. So the Ministry of Education, there is a body called the National Educational Research Development Council. We have had meetings with them, and there is a platform that we kind of devised, which can be used in the classroom. And with this, there will be less emphasis on testing isolated phonetic, sounds and symbols, and then we're shifting more towards students' ability to actually use language, use English, and communicate in real time situation. And then it doesn't matter if they sound like an Hausa speaker or a Yoruba speaker or an Igbo language speaker, but then as long as they're able to communicate effectively, as long as they're able to convey the right messages, the government is actually, beginning to accept it. We have had meetings with the examination bodies. I personally had made a presentation at the National Examination Council, and everyone looked at it and they felt that, yes, this is good. So the practical steps that need to be taken is to, because before anything is implemented in the schools, it has to be backed by some form of legislation and formal adoption into the curriculum. So I think, the stage we are now is the stage where we go beyond this, oh, this is good, this is good, this is good, and actually come up with documents, legislations that would incorporate these things into the mainstream curriculum. Because even the teachers, we have had series of teacher, training workshops and all. Everybody says this is good, but they will tell you, well, I have a job to protect. I'm not authorized to do certain things if the authorization doesn't come from above, like they said. So the practical step, I think there has been enough awareness, but the practical step now is, for these things to be backed up by some form of legislation. And when that is done, that's going to introduce a lot of revolution into the classroom. And that is when we will begin to, be able to recognize all these things we're saying, to know that even beyond the variations in Nigeria, there are global variations. Things are changing. The world is dynamic. Society is evolving, and we have to, tag along. So basically, backing things up with appropriate legislation is one giant step that Nigeria needs to take now.
Yes, I mean, I think that's a really important point, that when it comes to what teachers do in the classroom, a lot of that is very top down. It comes from somewhere. Not all teachers have the freedom to just teach whatever they want, because they have to follow curriculums, and their students have to achieve certain outcomes in order to progress. So there's a lot of factors there beyond just what a teacher individually wants to do. So I guess what I gathered from what you said, Joy, is that it's really important for there to be systemic changes, not just everyone agreeing that this is good, but actually committing to it through legislation. And, but it's good though that. And I think it's really encouraging that at least it looks like, from what both you and Hejong are saying and the projects that you have been engaged in, that the governments are finally willing to listen. And I'm hoping that all the research, and I'm sure that all of the research that people in your field, in world Englishes, in English language teaching, in education, and all the research you've been doing that has been done in the past few decades have really contributed to that.
Yes.
And I guess also, hopefully, the work that Catherine and the OED pronunciations team are doing on documenting different varieties of English in the OED, hopefully that would provide even more vital information that people like you who do research in education and teaching policy can use in making your arguments, to make your case much more convincing when you present these to the actual decision makers that can really make the systemic changes that need to be made in order to have a more equitable teaching in the classroom. Yeah, so at least that's the hopeful note I'd like to end with. So any concluding thoughts on this? What do you think? Any other encouraging things that you think will happen in the future? Any future plans for further research?
I think, my work will be from now on will be all about raising awareness of other Englishes. I think that's my first thing. And then we have to use OED material, Catherine's and Tanika, your work, to put into not only L2 context, but also L1 context. L1 these days in globalized world, L1 is not, just L1 in the past. 40% of students in Victoria alone and speak other than English at home. And plus, they speak English, different varieties of English at home. So I think that's the first thing that I like to do. And then that's my future and current research agenda.
Well, glad to hear it. Joy?
Yes. For me, I think technology is really, really playing a very, key role, because some of the challenges, some of the things you have are due to limitation, very limited infrastructure, facilities, resources, and all. But you see, the role of, artificial intelligence, technology, digitalization in education is one aspect that is really, really, really helping. We hope, in the near future, we hope to see more of software engagement and hardware engagement in the classrooms, because especially in ALT is one aspect, in education where technology, artificial intelligence, and digital innovations are going to play a very, very, very key role, because it is cheaper, it is faster, it is more convenient. You could reach to, a wider range. For example, we're talking about teacher education. For example, if you want to do awareness, if you want to do, if you had online, like we have in OED and all of that, it is easier to network. Teachers within Nigeria, networking with teachers from all over, in different parts of the world. So I'm seeing a situation where we're embracing more of technology, bringing it into our classrooms, bringing it into teacher development. Even at the British Council, for example, so many processes are being, changed on a daily basis. And I was speaking with someone the other day, and I said, see, the thing with technology and artificial intelligence is, if you don't align with it, then it sidelines you. That is just where we're going. So hopefully, digital innovations and technology is going to be embraced, to help us reach more people, in a more cost-effective and productive way.
Yeah, thanks, Joy. That's a really interesting point. And also, even just on the level of exposure, now that everyone's online,
Yeah.
more, you have access to voices that even just a decade or a couple of decades ago, you wouldn't otherwise have any exposure to. So I think that makes people a bit more open to hearing. So hearing other voices, hearing other accents isn't as, jarring as it used to be, because it happens all the time. And hopefully that will also contribute to us seeing some changes in people's attitudes towards language variation.
I think I don't have a great deal to add to what the other panelists have already said, but I am really happy to think that the models that we built, which were, as I say, really to support, why have you used this transcription? Why have you, to be able to say, to show our working, if you like, this is the thinking behind this, and this is the model that we've chosen, and this is the reasons why. For them to have an application in forming policy and legislation in the ways that you said, what is needed next. That's wonderful, and anything that we can do to make them more accessible for that and more useful for that, then I'm very keen to hear about it, because that's a way to turn around the status of the dictionary in modelling what English ought to be. It's a way to say, well, look, here in this greatly upheld big daddy of dictionaries, we have this variety of English recognised and presented. So you can't say that it's not something that we should assess to be correct. So that wasn't the original concept behind making the models available, but it certainly seems like something really exciting that I want to be able to pursue.
Yeah. That's, and Catherine, to your point of as lexicographers, you're always kind of, especially for a descriptive historical dictionary as like the OED, we're always kind of uncomfortable with that kind of role that you've been given of being the authority of the English language. Well, we do say that on the website. The OED is the authority on the English language, but it is an authoritative dictionary, but not just in the sense that, not for the reasons that people think it has it. We say that it's authoritative because it's based on really sound research. But people seem to have also just assumed that, it's Oxford, it's the authority, and therefore, it can be believed. But since you already have that authority, why not use it to actually put other varieties of English into the foreground this time? And I think that's really what you're doing, Catherine, is using the OED's influence for good, since you already have it, and use it in a way to foreground other varieties of English, and make the OED really a starting point for the kinds of research that people like Joy and Hejong do. And also going back to Joy's point of technology, now that we're publishing the OED online and it's being updated 4 times a year instead of every 40 years, it can be a continuous process of improvement when it comes to the pronunciation models, right? So we rely on other people's research as well on creating these models. So when there are improvements made in the research, then we can immediately make improvements to the models as well. So they're not set in stone. Nothing is ever set in stone.
Yeah, it's a very dynamic process.
Very dynamic process, and dynamic in a way that matches the dynamism of English today. So yeah, so anything else? Any more thoughts before we give the floor to our audience and ask their questions? Right. So thank you. That was really a very interesting discussion. And so I see that we have even more interesting questions in the Q&A. So let's get started with answering them. First question is from Tukunbo Abigail Adayan. So sounds like somebody from Nigeria. So asking, do you think that the meaning of words as presented in the Oxford Dictionary of English will remain the same in all versions of the English language? Yes, Catherine, maybe this is an OED question that...
Well, but it's a meaning question, Danica. That's more your wheelhouse.
Oh, it's a meaning question. But I think my answer could also apply to pronunciation, is that actually it's the opposite. What the OED shows is that meanings, pronunciations, grammar, any element of language is never static. It's constantly changing. What we consider standard today, people thought were an error, maybe even just a few decades ago. So, and that's something that you can clearly see in the OED. If you engage with the content of a historical dictionary, you can see that nothing is, as we said before, nothing is ever set in stone in language. It's dynamic, it's changing. And if we accept that, it's much better for us. You don't get too stressed, thinking of, complaining about how things are changing, because that's just how languages work. And the dictionary shows us that that's how it is.
Yeah, I think our enterprise is to describe what is happening, whether that's describing meaning change or change in grammatical use or change in pronunciation. That is our job to describe those changes, and where different global varieties of English seem to diverge on those matters, then that's what we want to reflect. Yeah.
Okay, right. So moving on to the next question from Kelisiwe writes, I'm glad, I hope I'm pronouncing these names correctly. So it seems that syllables and phonics are related. So I would like to ask, as an English teacher, how would we use phonics to teach syllables and vice versa? Yeah, John, could you do a question?
How would we use phonics to teach syllables and vice versa? I mean, phonics teaching include syllables as well. It's part of they do together. But depending on the way phonics, there are many ways to teach phonics, so-called synthetic phonics. They're talking about sound, individual sound. While analytical phonics, they do have phonics with a syllabic attention to it. So it depending on what approach you use, I guess, depending on, again, some language is syllabic, some language isn't. So depending on your student's language background, I guess you want to choose which one you go about. Although in UK, as far as I know, synthetic phonics is mandated. So whether choice syllabic teaching is not allowed, I don't think, in UK L1 context I'm talking about. But I'm not so sure how ELT context. My advice will be depending on students' first language background.
Right.
Yep.
Joy, any thoughts on that?
Yes. Phonics and syllables like the chicken and the egg relationship. Actually, phonics is a syllable and the syllable is a phonic to be very elementary. But how do we use one to teach the other? For example, if you had a one syllable word like me, you to help the student, you could break it down into components to let the students know that there's an there and then there is an e sound. So when you do that, even though it's a syllable, but then you're trying to help the students to articulate that syllable. So the way to use phonics to teach syllables is, let the learner realize the components, of a syllable. Some syllables can be broken down into a consonant component and then a vowel component. So when you do that head splitting, you're bringing in phonics because there are two sound elements that are actually come together to form a syllable. So that's the relationship between. However, if it is a vowel, the e sound, for example, it is a phoneme in itself, and it's also a syllable in itself because it can stand on its own. So the thing is using one to break down the other to help the learner understand the constituent elements in the a unit of sound. That is the relationship between the both of them. But then, like we said, these things are not really sometimes they can be correctly used interchangeably, but then sometimes they are different. It depends on the purpose and the function it is serving you as a teacher, and the relationship, the message you are passing on to the learner per time.
Right. Thank you, Joy. And the next question is for you as well. So, Joy, are you from Willem Holman? Joy, are you saying that children in Nigeria need to identify correct IPA symbols? Is that what required of them for these tests?
Yes, I mean, strangely, that is a thing. In Nigeria, we write two, examinations, the WAEC and the NECO, the SSCE exams. So in the exams, they are expected to identify, correct IPA transcriptions. And you have to memorize an entire dictionary to be able to do that. Because even if you give me that question paper, you could bet that I can't even score 20%. That is the truth. Yeah. And unfortunately, what this has bred is, a level of examination malpractice. Because the truth is that when a test is unnecessarily demanding and outrightly unrealistic, you are creating room for examination malpractice. And that is one of the things we are battling with in the examination in Nigeria, because they can't cope with it. It is unrealistic. So asking them to do that thing which whoever sets the question cannot even attempt himself is a problem we have. And it leads to a lot of examination misconduct. So yes, that's what they are required to do in the final exams.
Thanks, teacher. Catherine, did you have any comments on that as well?
It's interesting. I interpreted that question differently. I thought the question was asking, was Joy recommending the use of IPA in understand? And so that actually wasn't the question. However, the thing that I was going to say is that, now you might say, I would say this, I'm a phonetician, but I think that the understanding of IPA symbols, for instance, allows a student to access an awful lot of comprehension of how accents and pronunciation works, and being able to understand. I mean, for instance, if you were thinking about the vowel space, quadrilateral vowel space, and the difference between bit, bet, and bat, and but, and how, if you're thinking about Australian English or New Zealand English, the area of that space that you do when you're saying the word bet is higher up than the area that you would do if you were saying the word bet in a British English accent, and so high up, in fact, that it might occupy the space that for a British English speaker is bit, and where you get that potential. I mean, that's the area, right? People aren't so concerned about, like, oh, this might be a little bit like this or a little bit like that, or a little bit front, a little bit back. But when it starts to trespass on what is conceived of as the territory of another sound, and now we won't understand you because we all think you're saying but when you're actually saying bit or whatever. I think a little bit of, in an educational context, a little bit of comprehension of what's physiologically, anatomically happening when you're making those sounds, and what symbols we might use to describe that. That could be really powerful, but I'm not an educationalist.
Actually, Hejong,
Absolutely.
Isn't like, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't that something kind of what the Korean alphabet kind of does?
Yeah,
Just,
yeah,
like,
it's a
give
Korean
an
thing.
idea of where to position
Of the
your
tongue.
different parts of your mouth.
The tongue.
Catherine, that's exactly what I'm talking about, bit and but. You have a phonological way and your students may produce it, but teacher here as a bit. Oh, so you don't have it. That's exactly what I'm talking about. So therefore, absolutely IPA as well as the sound along with it, audio sound must, because depending on your language background, you don't actually have that sound in your language. So you all about is imagining what that sound might like unless you hear that sound. So absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess it's really a matter of, again, contextualizing because I think what's happening in Nigeria is this: that learn these, abstract, learn IPA, but always attached to kind of like abstract things that have no connection to actual communication. But if I think being able to specify, how the system works, because that's how actors learn different accents, right? Because they are told where to position their tongue, and we're never taught that. Somehow you're just told, say it this way without being instructed how to say it, and then you're taught the symbols without any explanation of how that relates to the actual production of sound, as you've just described, Catherine. So it's not really about, IPA is bad, it's too abstract for the classroom, but it's really contextualizing it in a way that it will help students learn, to make it be an instrument for learning rather than a barrier. And speaking of, so we have another comment from William Holman. So Hejong, you made that point about how teachers should be made more aware about what varieties are out there. And it looks like the Department for Education here in England has some guidance about it in their phonics screening check at the end of year 1 in primary school. And he quotes, "When decoding pseudo word, all possible alternative and regional pronunciations are acceptable, but examples that the items that they give in this test are nonsense words such as trash." So So then teachers have to work out themselves what those possible alternative and regional pronunciations are, which is a bit strange because there's so many words that you can give as examples.
So
Actual words. So
I'm very against the using of pseudo words for phonics, but people will come to me head on. What are you talking about? It's that exact talking about, like, we really left the teachers to decide when teachers have very little understanding of varieties of English. But here they have maybe some exposure to within varieties of UK English in living in UK, because they may have some consistent, maybe some exposure to Liverpool English, whatever, regional English it is. But just department's position of it's up to you to decide. That's to me, very irresponsible. And I think that's when Catherine's teams have more work to do to inform your government, especially in UK. Synthetic phonics is so mandated for year one students. And my concern is, like in Australia, phonics is sort of a new push. So it's not as a concern as UK. UK primary school teachers not all speaking RP. And I don't know how they teach. Do they use program? They do use program, by the way. And do they play the sound to teach? What if teachers themselves don't pronounce the way the model have? I don't know, because synthetic phonics is so mandated. This is something my next research project, how teachers without the RP pronunciation handle the pressure to demonstrate model phonic sound. I don't know. That's a question for discussion for next round table. But
yeah, so we have time to answer a few more questions, one or two more. So Isabella Koppensteiner thanks us for this fascinating discussion. So she's asking, how prescriptive do you feel pronunciation assessment in teacher training so she's particularly asking about teacher training for non-native speaking prospective EFL teachers. So should they be assessed based on received pronunciation or general American English, for example, or what could alternatives be?
All Australian teachers will fail if they are based on RPO.
Yeah.
I will fail myself.
Definitely will. But maybe, again, it depends on the context.
Exactly.
Do you agree? Where is this teacher going to teach? So if they're going to teach in the Philippines, probably Philippines English.
Yeah.
If they're going to teach in Singapore English, but also maybe British English, because it's also used a lot in that context. And in Nigeria, Nigerian English, but also British English. So I guess it depends.
I guess so.
Think?
Yeah.
Okay, so now we can move on to a question from Tanara Zingaro-kun. So considering the great contribution from Joy on the need to review language teaching and assessment policy, i.e. to focus on the real language use and communication rather than on pronunciation of isolated lexical items, to what extent do you think dictionaries can contribute to that? Catherine, any thoughts on this? How can we help with this?
I mean, I think telling people about what we're already doing is actually quite key. I think events such as this one and anything that we do in terms of our engagement and talking about what we already have is probably the best place to start. Yeah.
John, Joy?
Yes. I think like just like it said, the role of dictionaries, is to be more encompassing, which is actually what the OED is doing, to be more encompassing and kind of highlight and project these variations and the communicative enrichments. Because the truth of the matter is, the ability of English to adapt in different socio-cultural contexts is one of the reasons why it remains as the leading language. And that's what the whole concept of decentering is all about. So we could use the OED to promote the concept of decentering. And if we're doing that, we're telling the Bangladeshi speakers, okay, yes, we understand you were born and brought up in Bangladesh, but then when you speak this English, you have to help us understand what you're saying, in spite of the uniqueness of your accent or your voice or your tone. at least we should be able to understand what you're saying. Now, when you say that to the Bangladeshi speaker, he doesn't feel let down. He doesn't feel inferior. He feels, okay, he is encouraged. Okay, he's going to even put in more effort to try to speak and pronounce that thing in such a way that you understand what he or she is saying. And by the time you do that, you've actually achieved the aim, instead of trying to impose a prescription and I know it must be like this, like that, like that, and like that. That has a way of putting people off and discouraging people and making them feel inadequate. It makes them feel insecure and they withdraw into their shells. So encourage them, but let them know that, yes, I understand. Help me understand what you are trying to say. And when you give that, when you approach them like that, they on their own begin to make efforts to modify what they are saying because they want you to get the message they're trying to pass across. So at the end of the day, you become prescriptive through descriptive approach.
My one sentence is, I think, I agree. I think dictionary is there for information, but enforcing that right way of saying it, I think I disagree. Do you know what I mean? I think dictionary is there for information only, not the authority to decide what is right and wrong. That's my view on this.
Yeah, and I mean, after all, dictionaries are reference works, so they're there for people to refer to it. It's something that people can refer to clarify any questions that may have about the use of English. So it's there as a guide. And I think, working on world Englishes in the OED, the most gratifying thing for me is seeing how. So I remember a few months ago, my cousin sent me this. So there was a Twitter fight going on because someone was complaining on Twitter about a Philippine English word. And so I went to see this thread and I was already like stealing myself for like a terrible discussion where people are just complaining about all of these horrible words that we invent in the Philippines. But I saw exactly the opposite. I saw people defending this Philippine English word and actually using the dictionary, using the OED to defend Philippine English, to show the existence of Philippine English, saying that look, a dictionary acknowledges that that we have our own way of speaking English in our country, so that we don't need to change. We're speaking English correctly the way that we are actually doing it, and that's not an attitude that we had when I was in school. So that's really encouraging to see younger generations sort of accepting the way they pronounce words, the way they use words, and using the dictionary as a way to kind of not really validate that, because no one needs any validation from the OED or any other dictionary. We don't need any validation from any dictionary, but it's good to have a repository of these words and pronunciation so that we can show just how dynamic the English language is.
There's so many interesting questions, though.
Actually.
There are many other interesting questions. So I'd like to say thank you so much for joining us today. I hope that this has been helpful to you, and hope that it has given you many ideas that you can bring to your research on pronunciation, or that you can bring to the classroom. Thank you. Thank you to Joy. Thank you, Hyejong, and thank you, Catherine. And hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye. Thank you.